What would you do if the dog who once saved your life started howling behind a cage because he knew you were walking away and you couldn't afford to save him back? The room buzzed with quiet chatter, the kind that lives in government buildings where people wait, unsure of what to feel. The fluorescent lights flickered just enough to make you notice, and in the doorway stood a man who didn't belong to that kind of stillness. His name was Jack Callahan. His boots, though polished, still bore the desert's fine dust, like tiny ghosts clinging to the edges of memory. His uniform, slightly faded at the seams, hung on a frame worn not by time, but by war. He walked with the kind of posture that told you, this man has seen things. But his eyes were soft today. Not the eyes of a soldier scanning for threats. No. Today, they were the eyes of a man looking for something he lost. Jack was not there to fill out a form or to maybe take a look like so many others. He came with a name burned into his soul, Shadow, a German shepherd. His partner, his brother, the only reason he was still breathing. Jack made his way through the rows of kennels, nodding politely to a woman holding a leash, past a young couple whispering over paperwork, past a wall of posters titled Adopt a Hero. Every step echoed louder in his chest. He reached the front desk where a man with a clipboard barely looked up. Name? Jack Callahan, he said. Purpose of visit? I'm here for a dog. The man finally looked up. Name of the dog? Shadow, K9, serial number 38917. Served with me in Kandahar. The man blinked, then tapped his keyboard. Jack waited. His hands, calloused and strong, trembled just slightly. Behind the desk, the man's tone became official. Well, Mr. Callahan, Shadow is eligible for adoption. But I should tell you there is an adoption fee, $7,500. The number hit Jack like a sniper round. He swallowed hard.
7,000 for him? Yes. Government rule. Covers his care, transport, transition, etc. Jack opened his worn wallet.
A few tens, a photo of Shadow from 2020, that was all. I'm on a vet's pension. I work part-time security, Jack said, voice low. That's more than 3 months' worth of checks for me. I'm sorry, sir, the man replied with zero emotion. Rules are rules. Unless you've got the funds, he'll go to the next civilian on the waiting list. That was when Jack heard it laughter. From the back of the room, a well-dressed man in a tailored navy suit nudged his wife and chuckled. Did he say family? It's a dog, not a person. The woman giggled, sipping her coffee. Jack didn't turn around. He didn't argue. He just looked down at his hands, the same hands that had once clutched Shadow's fur during rocket attacks, that had carried his wounded body through dust and smoke. Shadow had not been just a dog in Kandahar. Shadow was the one who dragged him out of an ambush, the one who lay beside him when Jack couldn't sleep, the one who howled when Jack screamed from nightmares. Shadow had patched holes no VA doctor ever could. But now, Shadow was locked in a cage, and Jack couldn't afford him. The desk clerk gestured toward the kennels. You can see him, just no touching through the bars. Jack nodded and walked slow, deliberate steps toward the back. He passed kennels with young pups, excited tails wagging. Dogs barking, dogs pacing, and then he saw him. Shadow, sitting quietly in the back of Kennel 14. Larger now, but unmistakable. Amber eyes. Torn left ear. That same low, calm posture, like he was always listening to something no one else could hear. For a moment, Jack just stood there. He didn't say a word. Then he knelt. Hey, buddy, he whispered. Shadow's ears perked. He didn't bark. He didn't jump. Instead, he stood, walked forward slowly, pressed his head gently against the metal bars. Jack reached through, touched his fur. His hand shook. Shadow let out a soft, choked whine. Jack closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he cried. Behind him, the laughter started again. "They'll never let him take the dog," the man in the suit muttered. But Jack didn't hear it anymore, because in that moment, nothing else existed. It was just a soldier and his dog. Two warriors, two survivors, one in a cage, one locked out, and a rule book standing between them. Jack Callahan had never walked away from a fight. Not in Kandahar, not during night patrols with bullets slicing the air, not when the desert heat scorched his bones. But here, inside a clean, air-conditioned military K-9 adoption center in San Diego, he was ready to walk away, not because he wanted to, but because the system left him no choice, and it was killing him. After the short reunion through the cage bars, Jack had stood up slowly, wiped the corner of his eyes, and returned to the front desk. He wasn't the kind of man to beg, but today, pride didn't matter. "Sir," he started, voice tight. "I know there's a fee, I get it, but Shadow isn't just some dog I picked out of a brochure. He's my partner. He saved my life. He pulled me out of an IED blast. I still have the shrapnel in my leg to prove it." The clerk, Mr. Whitaker, glanced at him but didn't raise his eyes. "I'm sorry. I don't make the rules." Jack placed his veteran's ID on the counter, followed by a copy of Shadow's deployment papers. "We were together for 2 years. He's trained to recognize my panic attacks. He's the only one who ever kept me calm on the worst nights." Still, Whitaker shook his head. "I believe you, sir, but unless you pay the $7,500 today, he'll be placed with the next eligible adopter." "You're not on the priority list." Jack's jaw tightened. "And who exactly is on this priority list?" Whitaker flipped his clipboard. "Let's see. Charles and Vanessa Blake. Civilian applicants. Dual income. No kids. Gated home. Their paperwork's clean and they passed the screening." Jack didn't even need to turn around to know who it was. From across the room, Charles Blake locked eyes with him. With his Rolex flashing and a smirk curling at the edge of his mouth, he took a long sip from a stainless steel travel mug. His wife, Vanessa, was scrolling through her phone. They looked like the kind of people who'd get a K9 because it looked good on Instagram. "They don't know him," Jack muttered. "They don't deserve him." Whitaker exhaled. "It's not about who deserves who, sir. It's about policy. You can fill out a financial aid request, but approval takes up to 90 days. Shadow will be gone by then." Jack blinked, as if trying to shake off a blow. 90 days. Shadow would be confused. He'd be handed to strangers, his military routine broken, his bond to Jack cut like a cord. "No," Jack said firmly. "He won't understand why I didn't come for him." Behind him, he heard Vanessa's voice, sharp and nasal. I hope he doesn't shed too much, and I want his ears cropped. He looks wild." Charles chuckled. "We'll fix him up. Maybe dye his fur for Halloween." That was it. Jack turned around. His voice was low but hard as steel. "You can't fix him. He's not broken. He's not an accessory. He's a soldier." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Relax, old man. It's just a dog. Just a dog." The words hit Jack harder than anything he'd taken in combat. Jack looked down at his wallet. Inside were a few bills, some 5s, some 1s. Barely enough for groceries next week. He'd skipped breakfast today to make gas last longer. There was a VA appointment he had to miss next month because of the copay. But he would have given every cent just to open that cage, just to say to Shadow, "We're going home now, buddy." He tried again. Is there any way I can do a payment plan? Work something off? Volunteer hours?" Whitaker's voice softened, but only slightly. "Mr. Callahan, I understand this is difficult, but this isn't a shelter. This is a federally regulated program. We have rules, and I can't bend them." Behind Jack, Charles gave an exaggerated sigh. "If he's done, can we move on?" "We have brunch reservations." Whitaker looked at Jack, then at the clock. "I'm sorry, but if you don't have the full amount, I'll have to ask you to step aside.
The next appointment is ready.
Jack's shoulders sagged. It was over. He gave one last glance toward the kennels. He could barely see Shadow now, just the edge of a brown ear behind the bars. He took a deep breath and picked up his papers. I served 21 years, he said softly. I lost friends. I lost pieces of myself, but I didn't expect to lose him to a price tag. Whitaker said nothing. Jack turned to leave, and then a sound. Low. Familiar. It came from the back of the room, a single bark. Then another. Then a howl that grew, echoing through the sterile walls of the center. It was Shadow. Calling out, calling for him. Jack Callahan had made peace with a lot of things in his life. He made peace with the scars on his legs. The ones no one could see were harder, those he carried in the dark. Behind the smile he practiced in the mirror. He had made peace with waking up some nights in a cold sweat, gripping for a rifle that wasn't there. He had even made peace with the fact that the war had taken parts of him that weren't coming back. But what he couldn't make peace with was watching his partner, his lifeline, his shadow be treated like a transaction. As Jack gathered his documents, voice trembling, he turned to leave the desk. Shadow's howls from the back kennels had just begun distant, but haunting. Then came a sound that cut deeper than any policy. Laughter. High-pitched, uncaring, mocking. Coming from the couple sitting by the waiting area, the same pair he had seen earlier. The ones Mr. Whitaker called ideal adopters. Charles and Vanessa Blake. Did you hear that? Vanessa chuckled, eyes wide with sarcasm. He said the dog understands him, like they talk or something. Charles leaned in, smirking. What was it? He dragged me out of an IED. Please. Probably just fell off a cot and blamed it on the dog. Vanessa laughed again. He acts like the mutt's a war hero. Jack stopped walking. His heart began to pound not from shame, but from heat. That slow burn that starts at the base of the spine and rises when a man hears the sacred being mocked. His hand curled slightly, not into a fist, but into restraint. He turned slowly, walked back to the front of the room, and looked Charles Blake in the eye. Let me tell you something, son, Jack said, voice level. That mutt you're talking about, he served 3 tours in Afghanistan. He saved 6 soldiers from ambushes. He detected IEDs buried deeper than your wine cellar. Charles smirked. Good for him. Still a dog, and dogs go where they're told. Jack took a step forward. No, he said quietly. Not this one. He doesn't follow orders from people who smell like cologne and think courage comes from stock options. Charles straightened up, now annoyed. You got something to say, old man? Jack didn't blink. I said it. Behind the counter, Mr. Whitaker looked uncomfortable. Gentlemen, please. This is a public adoption center. Let's keep things civil. Jack nodded. I'm civil, he said. But I'm also tired. Tired of watching good dogs handed off to people who want accessories. Shadow isn't a conversation piece for your next dinner party. He's a veteran. Vanessa rolled her eyes. Oh my God, are we supposed to clap? Jack ignored her. Instead, he stepped closer to the cage area. His mind drifted back to Kandahar. Back to the night everything changed. It was late past midnight. The stars above were barely visible through the dust storms that blanketed the base like fog. Jack and Shadow were doing their final perimeter walk when Shadow froze mid-step. His ears twitched. His eyes locked on a spot near a water barrel. That was all the warning Jack needed. He didn't ask questions. He trusted. And when Shadow lunged and knocked him back, the explosion tore through the air. Jack remembered the force, the heat, the ringing in his ears. He remembered crawling, screaming, trying to find Shadow's body, and when he did, buried beneath debris, alive but bleeding, Jack held that dog and wept like a child. That night, He didn't just survive because of Shadow. He survived because of love. And now, they were treating that love like a used car with too high a price tag. A young woman sitting across the room, probably in her 20s, with a hoodie that said, "Support our vets," stood up quietly and walked over. "Excuse me," she said to Jack. "Is it true? Did he really save your life?" Jack nodded slowly. "More than once." Her eyes filled. That's not just a pet. That's family," Jack whispered. "He's the only family I had out there." Then came a voice, low, gravelly, from the back of the room. An older man, Mr. Reynolds, dressed in a faded VFW hat and worn denim, stood up. "I did 2 tours in Nam," he said. "Back then, we didn't get to bring our dogs home. They left them there. We never forgave ourselves for that." He walked closer. "That dog knows who he belongs to. You can see it in his eyes." The mood in the room shifted. Other people turned toward Jack, not with pity but with recognition. They understood. They saw a man fighting not for sympathy but for a brother. Charles, sensing the tide turning, stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. Let's just pay the fee and go." But Vanessa hesitated. Her confidence cracked. Shadow's barking from the kennel was no longer faint, it was filled with panic, rising in pitch, a sound that felt too human. Someone in uniform near the wall finally spoke. "That's not just barking. That's a soldier crying out for his partner." Silence fell over the room. Jack lowered his head, eyes burning. "I don't have the money," he said. "I'd give anything," he added softly. "But I can't give what I don't have." He turned to walk out again. And behind him, Shadow barked, louder, desperate, determined, and heartbreakingly familiar. The bark of someone saying, "Don't leave me again." The barking faded. The chatter died down, but inside Jack Callahan's head, a louder sound had returned, the one he couldn't silence, no matter how many years had passed. The sound of the explosion. It started like any other night patrol in Kandahar. The desert air was thick with heat, even after the sun had long disappeared. The wind carried the faint smell of oil, sand, and sweat. The kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but tense, as if the ground itself was holding its breath. Jack and Shadow had been walking along the outer perimeter of FOB Maverick. It was their 4th rotation that week. Jack was exhausted, but alert. Shadow was focused, always was. Even when Jack's body ached, Shadow moved with the grace of something born for war. But that night felt different. "Easy, boy," Jack muttered, patting his sidearm. Shadow had stopped mid-step. His ears perked, his body still. A low growl started in his chest, not aggressive but warning. The kind of growl that meant danger was close, too close. Jack froze. He knew that growl, knew it better than any briefing, better than any intel report. He scanned the area. A water barrel stood 20 feet ahead, piles of rubble, too quiet. "Talk to me, Shadow," Jack whispered. Shadow lowered his head and took 1 step forward, then another. Then suddenly he lunged. It happened fast. One moment, Jack was upright, reaching to follow his dog's lead. The next, Shadow slammed into his chest, sending him crashing into the dirt. A split second later, boom, the world erupted. The air ripped open with fire and thunder. Jack didn't hear the explosion as much as he felt it inside his bones, inside his lungs. Sand, shrapnel, light, everything became one blur of chaos. He hit the ground hard. Dust filled his mouth. His ears rang. For a few seconds, there was only static. No up, no down. Just pain and confusion. Then reality snapped back. "Shadow!" he screamed. Jack crawled, coughing, through the dirt. His left leg was bleeding. He didn't care. He searched frantically, eyes darting between broken crates and blackened earth. And then he saw him. Shadow half buried under debris, not moving. No, 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 Jack murmured, pulling at twisted metal, wood, anything to get to him. His hands bled, but he didn't stop. Finally, Shadow stirred.
A soft whimper. Jack froze. Hey, I got you, buddy.
I got you.
Shadow's eyes fluttered open. One ear was torn. Blood stained his paw.
But he was alive. And he'd done it. He saved Jack's life. Later, at the field hospital, Jack's injuries were treated first. His leg wrapped, shoulder stitched, a mild concussion noted. But he refused to sleep until he saw Shadow. The vet unit patched up the dog. Torn ligament,
cracked ribs, minor burns. He's lucky, the medic said.
No, Jack replied. I'm the lucky one. That night, Jack sat on the floor beside Shadow's cot, one hand resting gently on the dog's side, feeling his chest rise and fall. Neither of them said a word.
But they didn't have to. From that day on, they were inseparable. When Jack's nightmares came, Shadow was already at his side, head under his hand, eyes steady and calm. When the gunfire outside camp roared, Shadow didn't flinch. He watched Jack, waited, and moved when Jack moved. He wasn't just a bomb sniffer. He was a soul reader, a silent anchor in the storm. And when the tour ended, when the military announced Shadow was being retired due to injury, Jack put in the request to adopt him that same week. But paperwork was slow. The request stalled, and Shadow was shipped back to the States alone. Jack never forgave himself for that. Now, standing in a sterile adoption center in San Diego, with Shadow crying in the back kennel and strangers treating his partner like a product, Jack wasn't just upset. He was reliving that moment in the rubble, thinking he had lost him forever. And this time, he wasn't going to walk away.
He turned toward Mr. Whitaker at the desk again. I get it, he said, voice low but steady.
Rules, fees, policies, fine, but this dog isn't just some rescue case. He's my partner.
He bled with me. I understand that, Mr. Callahan, Whitaker said cautiously, glancing toward the couple waiting to adopt. But our hands are tied unless you can pay the full amount. Jack nodded slowly. Then let me tell you something. He turned toward the rest of the room, toward Charles and Vanessa Blake, toward the onlookers who had started to gather. And with a soldier's calm, he spoke. In Kandahar, there was no adoption fee, no interview process, no background check. There was only instinct. Shadow saw death before I did. He pushed me out of the way and almost died doing it. He didn't stop to ask if I had cash. He didn't wait for a clipboard. Jack's voice cracked slightly, but he didn't stop. He just did it because he's a soldier, just like me. And now, all I want is to bring him home. Silence followed. Vanessa looked away. Charles shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Whitaker didn't respond. From the back of the room, Shadow barked again. A low, heartbreaking sound, the kind of sound that didn't need translation. It said one thing. I remember too. Jack Callahan didn't know how his legs carried him to the back of the room. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the same invisible pull that once led him through smoke-filled valleys in Kandahar with nothing but trust in his partner to guide him. Now here he was again, walking down a quiet corridor lined with steel cages and concrete floors. But it wasn't fear he felt. It was something deeper, a mix of hope, guilt, and a yearning so sharp it made his chest ache. Each kennel he passed was filled with motion dogs barking, pacing, tails wagging. Some jumped up, hoping for attention. Others huddled in corners, wary and forgotten. But none of them mattered, because at the end of the row in kennel number 14, Jack saw him, Shadow. He had changed. Of course he had. Time had added a few grey hairs along his snout. One ear still bore the jagged scar from that night in Kandahar, the night that lived in both their bones. He was thinner now, a little stiffer in the legs. But the moment their eyes met, Time dissolved. Jack stopped in his tracks. He couldn't speak. He didn't need to, because Shadow had already stood up. Slowly, deliberately. His ears perked. His tail didn't wag, it quivered, caught between disbelief and recognition. Jack stepped forward, and that's when it happened. Shadow pressed his head gently against the steel bars. Jack fell to his knees. His breath caught. His hand reached out, trembling. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, voice cracking. "I'm so sorry it took me this long." Shadow let out a low, broken whine, the kind of sound that didn't come from the throat, but from the heart. Jack slid his fingers between the bars, grazing familiar fur coarse but comforting. His palm cupped the side of Shadow's face, thumb brushing just under his left eye, where a small scar remained. "I didn't forget you," Jack murmured. "I couldn't forget you." Shadow didn't bark, didn't jump, didn't demand. He simply stayed there, head pressed against the bars, eyes locked with Jack's, those amber eyes that once scanned the edges of war for danger, now filled with one emotion only: relief. From behind, the quiet buzz of the center resumed. Papers, shuffling, distant conversations, an intercom announcing the next visitor. But to Jack, the world had gone silent. It was just him and Shadow, two soldiers, two survivors, meeting again across man-made bars and a price tag neither of them had asked for. Suddenly, a voice broke the moment. "Sir, if you're not adopting, please step away from the enclosure." It was Mr. Whitaker, standing near the desk, clipboard in hand. Jack didn't move. He gently pulled his hand away, stood up, and nodded without looking at him. "I just needed a minute," he said softly. From the corner, Charles Blake's voice echoed again, impatient and dismissive. "Is he done playing war stories with the mutt?" "Some of us are here to actually adopt." Jack turned to leave. He didn't say anything this time, not because he agreed, but because he knew. Shadow already said everything. The way he moved, the way he leaned into Jack's touch. The fact that in a building full of noise and strangers, Shadow had only stood up when he saw him. Back in the lobby, Jack sat on the bench, elbows resting on his knees. He stared at the ground, letting the weight of the moment settle. Shadow was alive, Shadow remembered, and Shadow still wanted him. But it wasn't enough, because between them stood $7,500 and a couple who saw Shadow as nothing more than a conversation starter at cocktail parties. Jack closed his eyes. He could still feel the heat from Shadow's body, even through the cold steel, could still hear that whimper, could still smell the faint trace of desert sand in Shadow's fur. "How do you walk away from that?" Then a soft voice beside him. "You're Jack Callahan, right?" He looked up. It was the young woman in the Support Our Vets hoodie from earlier. "I watched you and him back there," she said. "That wasn't just a dog saying hi. That was—" She shook her head, fighting emotion. "That was family." Jack nodded. "He's all I had when everything else fell apart." She sat beside him. "Do they really want $7,500? She asked. Jack gave a tired laugh. "They do. And they mean it." She looked down, thoughtful. "I have $20, she said. "Not much, I know. But it's something." Jack blinked. "Miss, it's not pity," she interrupted. "It's respect." From across the lobby, a murmur spread. People had been watching, listening, feeling. And for the first time since Jack walked in that morning, he wasn't invisible anymore. Back at Kennel 14, Shadow had returned to his corner, but he wasn't lying down. He was watching. Waiting. His eyes never left the hallway where Jack had stood, because Shadow knew. This wasn't over. Not yet. The front desk phone rang. A printer hummed in the corner, and Jack Callahan sat frozen on the bench, still feeling the weight of Shadow's head against his palm. Across the lobby, Charles Blake stood with his clipboard,
checking his watch for the third time.
Honestly, he huffed, how long does it take to hand over a dog? His wife, Vanessa, adjusted her designer sunglasses indoors and rolled her eyes. He's probably still back there whispering military secrets to the mutt. They laughed again. The sound was like sandpaper against Jack's nerves. But he stayed silent, because part of him was still in that kennel, still kneeling in front of those amber eyes that knew his soul better than anyone alive. Then it happened. Mr. Whittaker stepped forward from the counter. Mr. and Mrs. Blake. You're up. Vanessa clapped her hands like she had just won a prize at an auction. Finally! The couple followed Whittaker down the hall, their footsteps echoing off the tile floor. Jack didn't follow. He couldn't. He knew what was coming, but he wasn't ready to watch it. Back in kennel number 14, Shadow stood at full attention. His body still faced the front, ears forward. Eyes locked on the hallway, waiting. But it wasn't Jack who appeared. It was them. Charles and Vanessa stopped in front of the kennel. Vanessa leaned forward and tilted her head. Huh. I thought he'd look cleaner, Charles smirked. Still has that military stink. Then Vanessa reached into her designer tote and pulled out a shiny new leash bright red with rhinestones and a gold clasp. Isn't it cute? She said. It was like $50. She opened the latch on the kennel gate and stepped inside. What happened next would stay with everyone in that building forever. At first, Shadow didn't move. He watched her approach, eyes wary, ears twitching. But as soon as she lifted the leash, he backed away slow, calculated steps toward the corner of the kennel. She took another step closer. Come here, puppy. That's when he growled. It wasn't loud, it wasn't threatening, it was low. Sad. A growl of heartbreak. A warning not of danger, but of rejection. His tail dropped, his whole body tensed. He wasn't angry. He was afraid of what was being taken from him. Charles laughed nervously. Looks like he needs training. He stepped into the kennel. Shadow's growl deepened. His body crouched lower. And then he barked, loud, sharp. Desperate. The kind of bark that makes you stop in your tracks. The kind of bark that isn't meant to scare. It's meant to reach someone who had walked away. The room went silent. Even the receptionist froze. In the lobby, Jack stood slowly. His heart started to race. He knew that bark. He had heard it in Afghanistan once, when Shadow thought Jack had been shot, and now he was hearing it again. Something's wrong, Jack muttered. He walked toward the hallway. Behind him, the young woman in the Support Our Vets hoodie stood up too. So did Mr. Reynolds, the Vietnam veteran. They followed. And when Jack turned the corner, he saw it. Shadow was barking non-stop now, backing into the far corner, eyes wide, chest heaving. Charles stood frozen. Vanessa held the red leash out like it was a dead fish. I don't think he likes us. Mr. Whittaker stepped between them. Please step back. You're stressing the dog. He's defective, Charles snapped. We'll take another one. Jack stepped forward. And the moment Shadow saw him, he stopped barking. Dead silence. Then a low whimper. Then Shadow took one step forward, then another, and then he ran. Not to attack, but to break free. With a surge of strength that surprised everyone, Shadow slammed into the kennel gate, paws clawing at the latch, body straining toward Jack like gravity itself had shifted. Gasps filled the hallway. Vanessa backed up. Is he going to hurt someone? She whispered. But Jack didn't flinch. He stepped forward and knelt again, just as he had earlier. It's okay, he whispered. I'm here, buddy. I didn't go far. Shadow let out a trembling howl, and then one paw lifted, reaching through the bars like a child reaching through prison glass. The building stood still. Then came a voice. Not Jack's. From the crowd that had gathered behind him. It was Officer Pierce, the young man in uniform who had watched from the lobby. He took one step forward and spoke to Whitaker.
Sir, that's not a dog begging for attention. That's a soldier crying for his partner. Mr. Whitaker said nothing.
His hand hovered above his clipboard. Behind him, Charles and Vanessa stood frozen, unsure of what they'd just witnessed. The laughter was gone now, replaced by silence, reverence. Jack turned to the crowd. "I can't afford him," he said softly. "They won't let me take him home." Then he looked back at Shadow still straining against the gate, eyes locked onto him, leash untouched on the floor. "And I think he knows it," Shadow whimpered again. And this time so did half the room. The leash lay untouched on the floor, bright red, polished, and utterly meaningless now. Shadow remained pressed against the kennel door, his claws scraping the steel, his chest rising and falling in frantic bursts. He wasn't barking anymore. He was wailing, a sound raw and human, like it had traveled from somewhere deeper than the lungs. It echoed through the building, bouncing off the walls like a distress call from a battlefield no one else could see. Jack Callahan knelt on one knee in front of the gate. "I'm here," he whispered again. "I didn't leave you." But he had. Not by choice, not by will. Just like in Kandahar, when Shadow was airlifted out before him. Just like 2 years of silence and paperwork. Just like today, when a price tag bigger than Jack's pension came between a bond forged in fire. And now he had to do the unthinkable. He had to walk away. He stood slowly, painfully, like something inside him resisted the motion. Shadow whimpered louder, sensing the shift. Jack reached out once more, laying his palm on the cage bars. "I'm sorry, boy." "I tried." His voice cracked. "I really tried." Then he turned around. Behind him, the hallway was full. Sophie Carter, the young woman in the Support Our Vets hoodies, stood with tears in her eyes, both hands covering her mouth. Mr. Reynolds, the elderly Vietnam vet, clenched his jaw and looked away, as if trying not to relive something he'd buried decades ago. Officer Pierce, still in uniform, stood at full attention, eyes locked on the cage like it held something sacred. Even Mr. Whitaker, the no-nonsense staffer, was quiet, his clipboard at his side, forgotten. No one spoke, no one moved, except for Shadow. The moment Jack turned his back, Shadow let out a sound so heart-wrenching, so full of betrayal, it made the room flinch. It wasn't just a whine. It was a cry. The kind you hear at funerals, the kind that carries centuries of grief in one broken breath. And then he lunged. The steel rattled. The entire cage shuddered. Shadow threw his full weight against the gate again and again, barking now frantic, guttural, like he was trying to break the world in half, just to reach the man walking away from him. Everyone turned. Even Charles and Vanessa Blake, who had retreated to the corner, looked on in stunned silence. Vanessa finally whispered, I don't think he wants us." No one corrected her. Because she was right. Jack froze mid-step. His shoulders dropped. His fists clenched. He didn't turn around right away. He couldn't. Because turning around meant acknowledging something he didn't know how to fight. The look in Shadow's eyes. That pure, desperate need. The kind you only feel when someone you love is slipping through your fingers. And then it happened. A voice broke the silence. Not loud. Not angry, just firm and full of quiet authority. "Let him say goodbye." It was Officer Pierce. Everyone looked at him. The young man didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on Shadow. Then another voice added, "He's not barking for attention. He's crying for his partner." That came from Mr. Reynolds, now wiping his glasses with trembling hands. Jack turned around. Finally. His eyes were red, his throat tight. He walked back slowly, each step like wading through mud. And when he knelt in front of the gate again, Shadow stopped barking. Instantly, the entire building went silent again.
Shadow whimpered once, then pressed his forehead into the bars, letting out a breath like he'd been holding it since Jack turned away. Jack leaned his head forward too, their brows nearly touching through cold steel. "I'm here," Jack whispered. "I never stopped being here." Mr. Whittaker cleared his throat, but this time his voice lacked its usual sharpness. "Sir, if you don't have the funds—" He didn't finish, because before he could, Sophie Carter stepped forward. "I'll pay the first 1,000, she said, voice trembling. "I don't have more, but I'll figure it out." Then came Mr. Reynolds. "Count me in for 500, he said without hesitation. Someone else, an older woman near the doorway, pulled out her checkbook. 300 from me. I'll cover his vet bills, a man in a maintenance uniform called out. "I can send a Zelle right now," said a teenager with earbuds. One by one, voices filled the room, not shouting, not for attention, just people stepping forward. People who had seen something sacred and refused to let bureaucracy kill it. Within minutes, a pile of bills, cards, and offers to Venmo sat on the front counter. Jack didn't move. He was still kneeling, hand pressed to Shadow's. But behind him, America was moving, not the one on the news, the real one. The one made of strangers who understand the difference between a pet and a brother. Mr. Whittaker stared at the counter, then at Jack, then at Shadow. His eyes softened. He tapped his pen once. "Well," he said, voice quiet. "Looks like he's yours. Looks like he's yours." The words hung in the air like a sunrise breaking through storm clouds. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Jack Callahan stayed kneeling by the cage, his hand still pressed gently to the steel, his forehead leaning into the bars. Across from him, Shadow stood still, eyes locked, body shaking not from fear, but from relief. Then came the sound. A single metallic click. The cage door was being unlocked. Mr. Whittaker, who only moments earlier had stood as the gatekeeper of policies and procedures, now reached forward with both hands. The door creaked open. Shadow didn't rush. He didn't bark. He stepped out slowly, with the kind of grace only a soldier understands, knowing that every movement mattered, that this was no ordinary moment. When he reached Jack, he paused just for a second, then collapsed into him. All 85 pounds of German Shepherd melted into the arms of the man he'd been trying to reach since the day they were separated. Jack wrapped both arms around Shadow's neck, burying his face into the dog's thick fur. He didn't say anything. He just held on. His shoulders shook, and for the first time in a long, long time, he cried without shame. The room went silent again, but not cold, not distant. It was the kind of silence you hear when people witness something holy, the kind of silence that means respect. Behind them, the woman in the Support Our Vets hoodie wiped tears from her face. Mr. Reynolds placed a hand over his heart and whispered, "That's how it should be." Even Officer Pierce, the young soldier in uniform, looked away for a moment, blinking quickly. In the corner, Charles and Vanessa Blake stood awkwardly, unsure of what to say. For once, they said nothing. And quietly, they turned and walked out, leaving behind the leash, the paperwork, and the lesson they would never understand. Back at the front desk, Mr. Whittaker cleared his throat. I'll need to process the donations," he said, a little sheepishly. "We're at 7,285. "Make it 7,500 odds," a voice called out from the doorway. Everyone turned. It was the janitor grey coveralls, mop in hand, wiping his palms on a rag. "I've been watching from the hallway," he said. "Didn't think I could help." "But I got $50 I was going to spend on a fishing reel," he chuckled. "Guess this catch is better." Applause broke out, not loud, not chaotic, just soft clapping like church. Jack finally stood, one hand still on Shadow's back. "I don't know what to say," he said. "You don't have to," Sophie Carter replied, voice steady now. "You already did when you showed up for him." Another voice added, "He showed up for you first,
Now it's our turn. Jack looked at them, at all of them. Ordinary people, young, old, retired, active duty, civilians.
And he realized these weren't strangers anymore. They were witnesses to loyalty,
To sacrifice. To the kind of love that doesn't come with a receipt. Shadow looked up at Jack, his tail wagging slightly, now slow, measured, as if he too understood what had just happened.
Jack knelt once more.
"You're coming home, buddy," he whispered. Shadow licked his cheek. Before they left, Mr. Whitaker handed Jack a simple folder. Inside was Shadow's official transfer paperwork, along with a certificate labeled Honorable Retirement, K9 Unit Number 38917. Underneath, someone had scribbled in pen, "Returned to his rightful partner." As they walked out of the center, Jack didn't feel the weight of his old injuries. He didn't notice the ache in his knees or the sun in his eyes, because beside him, trotting proudly down the sidewalk, was his brother. No leash. No command, just a quiet understanding that neither of them would ever be alone again. At the curb, an elderly woman stepped forward and handed Jack a small homemade treat bag. "For the hero," she said with a smile. Jack looked down at Shadow. "Which one?" he asked gently. She winked. "Both." In a world that too often forgot its warriors, both two-legged and for this small act of unity, of shared humanity, had rewritten the rules. It wasn't about policies. It wasn't about money. It was about showing up for those who never stopped showing up for us. And so, as Jack and Shadow disappeared into the sunlight side by side, no one in that building would ever forget what they'd witnessed. It wasn't just a man and a dog. It was a story, a promise kept, a nation remembering its own, a reunion that belonged to all of us. The metal latch clicked. The cage door swung open, and just like that, after months of waiting, after 2 years of silence, after minutes that felt like war, Shadow was free. But he didn't bolt. He didn't bark or leap or run wild like most dogs would after being caged too long. No, he stepped forward with intention. Every paw placement was measured, controlled, like a soldier crossing into familiar terrain. And when he reached Jack Callahan, he stopped. For a heartbeat. Just one. Then he leaned in and collapsed against him. The sound that came from Jack wasn't quite a sob and not quite laughter either. It was something in between, something raw and pure. His arms wrapped around Shadow's neck, and his head dropped to the thick fur at the dog's shoulder. His shoulders trembled not from weakness, but from everything he had held in since they were separated. He didn't care who was watching, not Mr. Whitaker, not Sophie, not Officer Pierce, not even the dozens of strangers who had gathered to witness this reunion. Because in that moment, the world narrowed to one man and one dog reunited not by contract or law, but by loyalty. Shadow let out a low, soft groan and nudged his head beneath Jack's chin, the way he used to during the nights Jack couldn't sleep in Afghanistan. "And Jack?" He buried his face in that same spot and whispered, "I got you, buddy. You're home." Applause began slowly. Scattered at first, then it built. A veteran clapped from the back of the room. A teenager followed. Sophie wiped her eyes and started clapping too. Within seconds, the room echoed not just with sound, but with something deeper. Honor. People weren't clapping because it was heartwarming. They were clapping because it was right, because something broken had just been made whole. Later, as Jack walked toward the exit with Shadow trotting beside him, someone asked the question every pet owner knows too well. Does he still remember the commands? Jack smiled faintly and looked down at his friend. Shadow, sit. The dog paused, then dropped to a perfect sit. Everyone chuckled. Jack bent down. Yeah, he remembers. Shadow tilted his head, tongue lolling like he was saying, "You didn't think I'd forget, did you?" Outside the center, the air was crisper, cleaner. The afternoon sun had mellowed, casting golden beams across the sidewalk. Jack took a deep breath. Shadow sat beside him, looking up. For a moment, they just stood there. Free, together, no barbed wire. No clipboard, no price tags, just man and dog. Veterans both. That night, they drove north along the California coast in Jack's old pickup. The windows were down. The radio hummed low some country station playing a ballad about home. Shadow's head was out the passenger window, ears flapping, nose catching every scent like it was his first time being alive again. Jack looked over, grinning.
"Missed that wind, huh?" Shadow barked once in response. Jack laughed. "Me too, partner."
Me too. They reached the outskirts of Colorado Springs just before midnight. Jack's home wasn't fancy, a modest cabin tucked against the edge of a tree line, but it was quiet. Peaceful. The kind of place where ghosts didn't yell quite so loud at night. As soon as they stepped onto the porch, Shadow sniffed the air, then walked over to the doormat and lay down like he'd been doing it all his life. Jack chuckled. "Still remember where to post up, huh?" Shadow gave a satisfied sigh. That was all. Inside, Jack prepared Shadow's old bedstill kept in the corner, even after 2 years apart. He poured water into a bowl, filled a dish with kibble. But Shadow didn't touch them. He followed Jack to the bedroom. And when Jack pulled back the covers, Shadow hopped up not onto the floor, not onto the blanket, but right beside him. Same spot as always. Jack looked over. "You sure?" Shadow stretched out, head resting just above Jack's boots. Jack left the lamp on, and that night, for the first time in years, he slept without waking up in a cold sweat. In the morning, they walked. No leash, no collar, just 2 soldiers taking a stroll down a dirt path behind the cabin where the pine trees lined the horizon like sentinels. They didn't talk. They didn't need to, because every step said, "I'm still here. I still got your 6. As the weeks passed, they settled into rhythm again. Jack fixed things around the property. Shadow kept squirrels in check. They watched sunsets from the porch, took naps in the shade. Shared silence in a way only those who've survived battle can, but they didn't just keep to themselves. Every Tuesday, Jack and Shadow visited the local VA hospital, not as patients, but as healers. In the waiting room, veterans in wheelchairs would reach down to pet Shadow, and suddenly smiles would appear where only silence lived before. A man with tremors would steady for just a moment. A woman with tears in her eyes would whisper, "He reminds me of mine." And Jack would kneel beside her and say, "He reminds me of me." Shadow wasn't just a dog anymore. He never had been. But now, more than ever, he had a mission: to remind broken men they weren't alone, to show that love could survive war, that sometimes healing had 4 legs and didn't need words. And every night, as the sun dipped behind the Rockies, Jack would sit on the porch with a beer in hand, Shadow's head resting on his boot. "I don't know how I got so lucky," Jack would whisper, and Shadow would look up like he already knew, because love finds its way back. Always. They never asked to be heroes, not Jack Callahan. Not Shadow. But somewhere between the battlefields of Kandahar and the quiet woods of Colorado Springs, they became just that, not through medals or ceremonies, but through something much deeper. Unbreakable loyalty. It had been 6 months since the day Shadow leapt into Jack's arms at the San Diego K-9 Adoption Center. 6 months since strangers, ordinary Americans, stood up and said, "You don't need to wear a uniform to recognize a brother." Since then, Jack and Shadow had become a familiar sight in their small town. People didn't honk when they crossed the street. They rolled down their windows and waved. Kids ran up to say hello, and store clerks left water bowls outside their doors. But more than that, they became a quiet beacon for other veterans who were still lost in the fog. Every Tuesday morning, Jack and Shadow visited the local VA hospital. They didn't have a fancy title, no foundation, no press. Just a simple purpose: to sit with those who needed to remember they weren't alone. In the beginning, it was small. Jack would walk through the lobby, Shadow at his side, calm, focused, tail gently wagging. Some veterans would glance up, smile politely, then look away. But Shadow was patient. He'd walk over, sit quietly beside a wheelchair, and lean just enough for his shoulder to rest against someone's knee. That was all it took. One-man Marine, Vietnam, double amputee, hadn't spoken in 3 weeks. The nurses said he hadn't made eye contact with anyone in over a month. But when Shadow leaned into him, he whispered, "That's a good boy." The whole room paused. No one said a word. Tears filled the nurse's eyes. Jack simply nodded, because he understood. Sometimes words don't come from the mouth. They come from the soul. Soon, their visits expanded. Shadow became a favorite among the nurses, the therapists, and especially the PTSD support group on Thursdays. Jack never led the meetings. He just sat in the back, Shadow at his feet, letting the silence speak louder than stories. But when a young veteran barely out of his 20s stood up one day and said, "If that dog can come back and trust again, maybe I can too," Jack knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. Outside of the hospital, they continued living life simply. Early mornings on the porch, long walks through the woods behind the cabin, fishing trips where Jack rarely caught anything but always came home smiling, and nights where Shadow curled up beside the bed like he never left. One rainy Thursday, a local reporter asked Jack if he'd be willing to share their story.
Jack hesitated. "I'm not looking for attention," he said. The reporter smiled.
Maybe not, but someone out there might be looking for hope. So Jack agreed. The article was short. Just 800 words. One photo: Jack, in his faded army jacket, hand resting on Shadow's back, both of them staring off into the distance. The headline read, "Two tours. Two souls, one bond that never broke." The story went viral. Veterans from across the country wrote letters. A widow in Texas said it helped her understand what her late husband could never explain. A K-9 handler in Pennsylvania sent a handmade collar with the words "Loyal Hearts" engraved in brass. Teachers read the story aloud to middle school students learning about trust and trauma. A senator's office called to ask if they'd consider coming to Washington to speak. Jack politely declined. "This story belongs to people like us," he said. Quiet folks who don't need a stage to matter. But the impact continued. Local shelters saw an uptick in working dog adoptions. More veterans signed up for animal therapy programs. People gave not out of guilt, but out of gratitude. Because one dog's refusal to leave his partner behind had reminded the country of something we're always in danger of forgetting. Some bonds aren't negotiable. Some love isn't for sale. And some promises are made without words, but kept for life. One evening, Jack sat on the porch, a worn flannel blanket draped over his knees. Shadow rested beside him, eyes half closed, ears still alert. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in ribbons of gold and rose. Jack reached down and gently scratched behind Shadow's ear. "Didn't think we'd make it this far, huh?" Shadow thumped his tail once. Then again, like he was saying, "I knew we would." Jack stared off into the trees, his voice low. "You know, but when I lost everything, they told me I'd never feel whole again. They were right for a while." He paused. "But then you showed up." Shadow nudged his hand. No bark, no sound, just presence. Steady, warm, unmoving. In the distance, wind rustled through the pine. An owl called once, a coyote yelped. And inside that tiny pocket of the world, there was peace. Not the loud kind, not the kind you shout about, but the kind you earn through tears, through loyalty, through choosing to keep loving even when everything says stop. As the stars emerged, Jack and Shadow stayed there, two silhouettes against a quiet sky. One man, one dog, two hearts, still loyal, still healing, still home. In a world that often moves too fast and forgets too easily, the story of Jack and Shadow reminds us that some bonds can't be priced, and true loyalty never expires. For many older Americans, veterans, widows, or those who've faced loss, this story brings back a timeless truth. A promise kept from the heart needs no words. When society overlooks the quiet sacrifices, it's the small moments, a look, a wag of a tail, a dog refusing to leave his partner, that reignite our belief that we are not forgotten. Jack didn't have wealth, but he had something more powerful, a heart that refused to give up. And those around him, ordinary strangers, showed that compassion is still alive when we choose to stand for what's right. So if you've ever felt left behind or unseen, remember this. Love, loyalty, and honor never retire.